Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of the Field and Garden Podcast. It is your friend in flowers, Lisa, and I'm really glad you dropped in, and I appreciate it because I know you have a lot of choices, your time is valuable, and I appreciate it very, very much. Now, if you're new here, I want to give you a special warm welcome and introduce myself. I am a field grower in the middle of the city. I'm located in southeastern Virginia, and my passion is empowering other people to learn how they can grow, cut flowers, whether it is for profit or pleasure. Because if you're like me, I never dreamed that I could grow a cutting garden. I never dreamed all the benefits, and then when I found out that I could actually build a business, friends, I was the happiest girl around, and I want to help other people do that and to do it successfully. So today I'm going to talk about choosing crops that make and save you money. And, so if you are familiar with us, you know that I primarily grow annuals. I do grow peonies, and I have a large inventory of hellebores, which are Lenten roses that grow in my shade garden that were a big cash crop for us. But beyond those two, I mostly grow annuals. And we're talking about growing warm and cool season annuals because what I've learned after all these years of flower farming is that they give you the biggest bang for your buck, and especially if you grow in a small space like I do. When we're talking about farm, small space, right? So I'm in the middle of the city. Our whole property is 2 3/4 acres. For the first decade of me flower farming as a business, I only had 1.17 acres, and on that property was my home and 3 outbuildings. So we had 2 fairly small cutting gardens that I ran with for a decade, and then we got another 1.5 acres adjoining our property. So while that is, right much if you've got a really small city lot, but for a production farm, we are pretty small. And I have just learned how to make the most out of my small space. And I did that with the intentions of to be low investment, potential high return. And that's where I circled back to annuals, cool season and warm season, and embracing them to maximize truly the 3-season growing out in a garden that has wide margins because of all of these things, right? But you know what else they have? They are also the lowest cost for you to learn and practice flower farming. We counsel so many people that one of the first things they do when they decide that they want to be a flower farmer, they invest in some of the high value crops like tulips, ranunculus, and starting to buy perhaps even perennials like peonies and different things. All amazing crops, y'all. Once you learn how to flower farm, once you learn how to grow them, have customers waiting and ready for them, right? So I'm not begrudging perennials and bulbs and woodies. I'm just saying that at this stage, I consider flower farming business. Anybody under 5 years for sure is, in my mind, I was still a beginner. And in reality, it's probably the first 10 years because there's just so many learning curves, right? So I learned about this big bang for your buck and how it also was the best way to make mistakes and to just not really cost you a lot, right? And I also discovered through my first decade of flower farming, when I was dabbling in all the high value crops, y'all, I wasted and spent tens of thousands of dollars investing in high value crops. And I had no idea what I was doing. I can remember when I was growing tulips in crates, they literally bloomed 2 months before I had customers. The farmer's market, they bloomed in late March, which is classic for tulips where I am. 2 months before the farmer's market actually, started, and I had no other flowers to go with them to start ramping up our florist business of making calls, making deliveries, and they weren't even sure why they needed to buy tulips from me at a higher price. Do you know what I mean? It was just too early in my journey. So I have learned that I made more money in less space, and you want to know what the end result of that was? Of just going through that high value mistake too early and then circling back around to, okay, I am figuring this out and I'm doing it with annuals so I can just chalk it up. But guess what I learned along that journey, y'all? That I was making more money on less space, but here's the clincher. I slept better at night, growing and maximizing annuals. You want to know why? Because I was not belly aching and fretting over high investment crops that I was still learning on. I had learning curves. And then, of course, you add in the normal business woes of things like losses from weather, pests, grower error. Maybe it's just slow sales. And then there's just basic disasters that happen, right? Think about, because those struggles are going to happen no matter what you're growing. But what a huge difference there is in investing in 1,000 seeds, let's just say they cost $50, and losing it versus purchasing 1,000 bulbs, let's just guess $500, and losing that. It just takes the pressure off of you. And I'm saying this now because this is a really frequent error that folks make, that we lose them, y'all. We literally lose them. And I say all this, if you have your heart set on growing some special crop, ranunculus, whatever it is, I'm not saying that you should never grow that. I'm just saying it's not time yet, potentially, for you to actually do that. And my method of flower farming is based on what I believe and see and hear that most people are actually looking to do. None of us, when we get into flower farming, think, oh, let's build a business that is incredibly high stress, maximum pressure applied, But we then turn around and start off with the highest, the highest risk crops there are, meaning you pay a lot for them, and it's not just put them in the ground and they grow without any help, right? So my methodology is to focus on growing the crops with the highest profit margins to maximize your returns. This just eases the pain points that take most beginners, people just getting started in flower farming, it takes them out, y'all. We lose so many potential great business people because they just jump in so hot and heavy, and it just is too much. And I understand. I totally understand. We want to do something that we enjoy each day, but not create a monster that's going to wear us down. And when you invest a lot of dollars, and it is riding on whether you grow it right and selling, there's enough everyday business challenges that you can minimize this part by not starting out with what the end game crops might look like, instead of starting at the beginning and start with annual crops and not create that monster breathing down your neck, right? So I share this because, as I've already mentioned, we lose so many great people, right? But it's so hard to resist this, y'all, because this is what the messages say that I get. They'll say, oh, I'm growing these tulips, but they're blooming and they're 3 inches tall. And I know that it wasn't really time for me to start growing them yet. But what do you think I did wrong? I bought like 5,000 of them. I mean, I understand the draw. And I'm just saying, friends, resist. I encourage you to stick with a plan. And this is the way that it's like an insurance policy to help smooth. You don't even know how rocky the road is until you're in it. And this is one rock you don't even have to go up against. So let's talk about number one, understanding your market's demand, right? So you have to know where you are planning on selling your flowers. And, for me, I focused out of the gate. When I first started flower farming, I first went to florist. And I did that because I was terrified to make bouquets. I couldn't figure out how to make bouquets. I will tell you that. I mean, I just thought I'll just sell straight bunches of flowers to florists, and that's why I did it. So I really focused on growing staple flowers and then growing them consistently, meaning that I tried to have them for as long as I could in the appropriate seasons. Because something that I learned fairly early, it was so easy to sell the same flower to whether it was a florist or a supermarket or whatever, week after week, because once they bought it and loved it, when it's on the list next week, they just buy it. You don't have to reintroduce it every single week. So you really need to understand what your market's demand is. And for me, I really focused on growing what sold every week to people that used flowers every single day in their flower business. And so what I mean by that is I did start out selling to florists out of the gate. I was so fortunate that, I actually stalked out a florist that I had been advised would be the best candidate. It was a high volume, upscale florist, meaning it wasn't a little mom or pop shop. Nothing wrong with mom or pop, but they typically weren't familiar with maybe some of the types of the flowers that I would be growing. Because what's your niche as a flower farmer oftentimes is growing stuff that doesn't ship in well, right? So it's garden flowers that they may not be familiar with. So I stalked out that proper customer out of the gate, and he really helped me to find my way. And what I learned was that, I hear, and just today on social media, somebody commented I was showing the first harvest of zinnias this year and how beautiful, I showed me harvesting them and showing them and stuff. And somebody posted in there, and they had farm in their name, so they were some type of business. Well, I heard that florists won't buy zinnias. And there's just so much unfactual information circulating around all of the time. I want to just say, please base all of your business decisions on business information from business people that have gone before you, not someone that has sold for a year or two, because it's just like people diving into high investment crops. People get so discouraged from that kind of talking. But what I learned from him is that he would buy pretty much every flower I grew if it is high quality and has great vase life. Basically, good quality cut flowers. And, I kind of swim against the stream on this. I sold the same staple flowers to my florist that I sold at farmers markets, the same flowers I sold to supermarkets, the same flowers I made to use bouquets for our members only market, the same flowers that we used for our bouquet subscription drop-off program. The bottom line is, while you definitely need to seek out your market and what they're looking for instance, I didn't focus on selling to event people because they're classically doing weddings. And all those people I just mentioned, they had a strong need for non-wedding colors, bright, hot colors, the colors that customers really ended up wanting. So for me, finding my demand worked out to be growing quality, but then tweaking my colors to what those markets wanted. Now, if I grew a peach zinnia, which I do, and peach coxcomb, which I do, those florists that I was selling to, surely if they had a peach wedding that weekend, they'd buy them. But guess what else? That peach that I sold was of a color that it was useful in all the other bouquets. I didn't have a saturation of that color. And I knew that because I understood my market's demand. So by adjusting my crop selection to meet these evolving needs of our target customer, I think about what this makes me think of. For instance, we succession plant like crazy here, right? That's our secret sauce. And so, the first succession, we're talking warm season right now. The first warm season, is still in early summer, like first in June, we're cutting that stuff. And you're still kind of in springy kind of colors. And then the next succession of warm season is in the dead of summer. That's what people are looking for, hot, bright colors, the summer hot pinks and, all of those types of colors. But then as we begin to plan and plant for our fall, we totally change the colors up. The burgundies and greens and reds and yellows and just those fall colors. That is the evolving, moving part. And that's also, for me, is what keeps this so exciting. I yesterday or this last week, we have this bouquet studio that happens now on our live garden and shopping show, right? My sister, who's the bouquet whisperer, makes a bouquet, and we do all kinds of different things. But anyway, this last week, she made the first warm season tender annual bouquet. Y'all, it was so beautiful. Had hot pink coxcomb and lime green coxcomb and bright colored zinnias and orange spike celosia, that Sunday that is just dynamite, right? And while she was building that, and then we had white sunflowers in it, it was dynamite. When I was watching her build that, and that was just the tip of the iceberg of some of the warm season annuals that we plant, right? It was so gorgeous. And why was it gorgeous? Well, not only were they just beautiful colors and flowers, they were crisp and fresh and weren't blemished because they were quality, y'all. Anyone that thinks growing just annuals is boring has not embraced growing annuals, right? So I grew the same staple flowers over and over and over and over again, changing colors, changing varieties sometimes to meet the different markets that I actually sold to. And it just simplified so much. So there were a couple of crops that I didn't sell across all of my markets that we produced. I guess I should say this. So my garden, when we were in high production for about 10 years, which stopped about 4 years ago, we were producing 10 to 15,000 stems of flowers a week from an 1.5 acre cutting garden. And if you know anything about succession planting, that 1.5 acres was not all being cut. It was at different stages, right? But there were a couple of crops that I didn't sell across all of our markets, but it was financially worth it to grow them for a couple of our markets. For us, those turned out to be sweet peas, Iceland poppies. They just didn't last long enough like to be used in our supermarket bouquets, and we didn't even put them in our bouquet subscriptions. However, for our members only market where people could choose the flowers, they make their own bouquets, We could say, well, sweet peas are gorgeous, but they only last about 5 or 6 days. And they're like, no problem, I want them anyway. They chose that. And it's the same with a florist. If we happen to have had poppies and sweet peas when they have this fabulous event going on that weekend, they knew that that wasn't going to last in somebody's, I'm sorry bouquet that you would expect to last for a week. So you have to really tweak your crops. But those sweet peas and poppies, we made it worth our time to grow them by pricing them appropriately and just offering them in certain markets, right? And then, let's just talk about taking a look at profit margins. Really, pricing is the hardest thing. There is nobody that can tell you what you should charge. You have to do your own research, and you have to see what the market bears, the markets that you're selling in, and then, of course, you have to apply your costs for each crop. That includes labor and materials and overhead, and that is different for everybody and everything. As the years went on, and Bobo and I, we often speak of this, we, after farming for so many decades, right? We've accumulated the best equipment. We know the best techniques. We're smoother, and it just allows us to streamline so very, very much. That sometimes that means we can grow something that may have been labor intensive in years past that we'd have never grown because we couldn't sell it cost effectively. You have to look at your expenses. And the big thing is, you should not I can't even get into talking about pricing, but friends, I'm telling you, in the beginning, when you might not have so many expenses, you just don't understand. Let's just take a sunflower, for instance. If you go to a farmer's market and there's an established farmer there, flower farmer, that is selling their gorgeous, sunflowers at the perfect stage for $2 or $2.50 a stem, and you think, oh my gosh, they are so easy to grow. I'm going to sell them for $1, and I'm just going to sell a bunch of them. But let me tell you something, friend. First off, you've just burnt your bridge of ever building a good working relationship with the other business people. But you have no idea the expenses that as your business starts and gets going, that you're going to start having that you perhaps don't have today. And it is really hard to recover from coming in cheap and low under the market. You have to trust that other professional flower farmers that have gone before you, looking at what they're doing, that there is reason and value in what they do, and take that into consideration. All right, so you have to think of all those things when you're thinking of pricing. And when you're determining pricing, of course, if you're selling to wholesale, you need to have a way to find out wholesale pricing. And there's, first off, I talk about that in flower farming school. We actually have a course called Preparing to Sell to Florists by Ellen Frost, who is a florist. And that's part one of the main topics in there, is how you come to figuring out what your pricing should be. So there's two different types of pricing. That's wholesale, selling to florists, supermarkets, people that are reselling what you are selling to them. Then there's retail prices. And you have to have a gate on those. If you're selling to florists, let's just say you're selling sunflowers to florists for $15 a bunch, and you're also selling them for that same price at the farmer's market, and one of your florists comes across there, no, they're not going to be happy. That's not the way this works, y'all. You have to figure this out because that's where your margins come from, is basing it on your expenses and what the market will bear and appropriately pricing. And you have to do that for every flower too, by the way. It's not just an overall. So taking a good look at your profit margin. So just think about that. You can sell a sunflower, and I'm just taking a gander. Let's just say if you sell a sunflower for $1.50 a stem, and how much does a sunflower seed cost? Not much. And you take a lily bulb, which cost, I haven't bought a lily bulb in a lot of years, y'all, but I'm going to say 65 to 75 cents wholesale. That's a big difference. And then you sell that lily $4 to $6. Yeah, that's more money, but look at the difference in what you're investing and all the rest of the picture. These are things you have to think about and consider. And what are you capable of? How are you at handling risk? Sleeping? These are things you got to think about. So the other thing is to think about waste and losses. Tracking what crops are you composting week after week. This is something I know that I didn't do a very good job of this back when I was in high production because we were just so overwhelmed. You are so hot, tired, and exhausted in season that you do not do a lot of observation that seems so obvious to outsiders. It's come live with me a day and you'll understand why I have no brain neurons left, But maybe on the calendar, you have a place where somebody just writes down, dumped 3 buckets of zinnias, dumped a bucket of coxcomb, or a bucket of this or a bucket of that, or however you're going to measure. You don't want people counting stems. If you're throwing them away, you're already losing, right? But to carefully track that. And, the other thing is to really implement, this is where so many people lose money, the harvesting efficiency and the stage to harvest. And that all goes back to really producing high quality, right? Streamlining your harvesting process and how you store flowers. My goal, and I still talk about this all the time with the team here on the farm because it's just so easy to forget this. When you reach down and cut a flower, I want it stripped and as you're moving it to the bucket or the bunch in your hand, you're stripping it and you're going to cut it to proper length and drop it in a bucket so it does not get touched again until it's inside, either being used to make a bouquet or being bunched to go to a florist. There is none of this resorting, regrading, recutting, restripping. That is such a profit suck. Every minute. You have to be a hustler, y'all. That's what it all comes down to. It's all about streamlining. I'm not expecting people to run. That's not what I'm implying. I'm saying doing the job right out of the gate so you don't have to redo it again. And, adjusting your production and your planting schedule to kind of align with your demand. We know that spring and fall is the highest demand, right? Spring, cool flowers is what we're talking about, cool season hardy annuals. Fall are warm season tender annuals in fall colors. For most people, if you don't have an established business with big standing orders, which is what floated my business all those years with florists, so we sold throughout the slow months because they were using my flowers even when they were slow because they still had funerals and those types of things to do. But think about this. Think about how much more efficient your business would be if you planned for the high demand spring and fall, kind of coasted during the summer, and don't plant tons of Lysianthus that blooms in late June and July and you have no customers. I love Lysianthus, but if you don't have market then, why would you do that? These are the things that I just never stopped back and paused and thought about. So, minimize your waste and losses can go to your profit as much as growing the right stuff and selling it, right? And then let's talk about season extension. Embracing the 3-season cool and warm annual cutting garden to extend your harvest is the most underused technique in cut flower farming business. especially, even if you have a hoop house or 2 or 10, why would you not maximize your field growing? That's the lowest investment place to grow, right? Grow the flowers that can be harvested over, the longest period of time. And, as I mentioned earlier, so I learned, because I could only grow outdoors in a garden, I've experimented so much with cool season hardy annuals. And I'm in zone 8A, and your zone really only tells you what you can actually overwinter, right? So there's a lot of cool season hardy annuals that I can fall plant, almost all of them. So back in the beginning, in my effort to extend the cool season crop harvest, stuff like snapdragons and bells of Ireland and all of those, and I did all kinds of experimenting, and I learned, and this is different for everybody, depends on where you are. I learned that there were some things, even though I do plant them in the fall, I would have the option to plant them again in very early spring. They wouldn't be as tall, perhaps, and as abundant, but they would bloom later than the same one that I planted in the fall. And this proved to work for some stuff, but it also proved to not work for other stuff. You have to figure that out. One case and point, I'm like a snapdragon crazy person. I love snaps. I grow like 6 or 7 different varieties. We actually have made custom mixes based on all of this. And I learned that fall planted snaps, if you can fall plant, the abundance and the quality of those stems from fall planted plants is unprecedented in very early spring and spring planted snaps. I mean, it's unbelievable, the difference, the volume, everything. But what I learned is, so I would try to plant again in very early spring. And in my conditions, where it typically gets hot and humid pretty early in spring and then just turns to hot and heavy around here, that the snaps that I planted in very early spring would grow, but they also got disease really quick. They were very predisposed to pests. And so I made the decision, guess what? We don't plant very early spring or spring snaps. It's just not worth it. That is really leveraging my season extension for its best. I've decided that I shouldn't grow snaps that way, right? And of course, if you have houses, I have no experience. Certainly structures can extend your harvest for sure, but more than anything else, expanding your harvest by embracing the 3-season succession planting of cool and warm annual is unprecedented, y'all. That is perhaps one of my biggest goals was with the Cut Flower Handbook, was for anybody to be able to read that book. The first section really tells you how a cutting garden works. And in there, it's how to figure out when you can plant a 3-season cutting garden. When you plant, what's your window to plant cool? What's your window to plant warm? Because this is really where you can maximize small space, outdoor growing, highest potential profit margins. And, the other thing I would say to you is identifying those opportunities to grow stuff to fill the gaps off season. So for instance, let's just say that you do have a slow season in the middle of summer, okay? Maybe you want to grow some flowers to dry them intentionally, to do something for fall, to make something. And that is something that I spoke about. I did a master class on this for the club, how to dry them and all that. But then we did a So What Now master class. Like, what do you do with the dried flowers now? And sometimes just sleeving them and selling them as straight bunches is the highest profit, because making stuff is labor intensive. But if that's your niche, if that's your specialty, if that's your passion, why not grow some flowers in the summer that you don't intend to sell fresh. You dry them, and then you're going to make something out of them to sell during November, especially for folks in the north, that have a shorter growing season. So you can identify gaps in the market, and all of that extends your profit margin in growing season. And then, strategically optimizing space, right? Strategically planning your crop rotations to ensure a consistent supply of high value flowers. And I'll tell you the case in point for this one. Do you know where in your garden you're planting cool flowers this fall and very early spring? Because do you have room? Have you left space in your garden for the flowers that bloom during the highest demand season of the flower year? That was also a light bulb moment for me, is I now plan my whole garden around where is the cool flower going to go, cool flower garden going to go. I set aside the largest block of beds, of which 2/3, if not a little bit more than that, is for fall planting because I do so much. But then also there's a place for the very early spring planted stuff, because this is what I hear in the fall. Oh my gosh, I planted so late because my other flowers weren't done. Y'all, what I would say to you is not only get the book, embrace this, but for me, my cool flower garden typically goes where my first warm season tender annual planting was. Do you know what I mean? Those are the first annuals planted, so they'd be the first ones to peter out. I don't plant stuff in there that I want to have in fall. Nothing goes, we start planting cover crop in there to hold it until it's time for cool flowers. You have to figure this out. You have to optimize space for the essential crops, right? And again, cool flowers, seed grown, high demand season, figuring out how you can get them to bloom as early as you can in your environment, whether that's through using low tunnels and covering them all throughout the winter to encourage them to be further along. And then lastly, my friends, embracing succession planting like there's nobody's tomorrow. It's the most underutilized moneymaker. So, so back in the day before I really understood the whole cool flower implication, right? I was always pushing the envelope, trying to get my warm season tender annual zinnias and coxcomb and all that stuff in the ground earlier than I should. It's like, okay, I'll plant them early and I'll row cover them and, I'll make sure they don't get too cold. That's not what succession planting is all about. Succession planting is really about planting plants at their optimal time. And when you embrace cool season hardy annuals and warm season tender annuals and learn when your planting windows are, you have something to plant pretty much all the time, except for in the dead of winter. And what that means is so for us here on my farm, we used to grow a lot of Iceland poppies. Iceland poppies and bachelor buttons were amongst and calendula were amongst the very earliest garden bloomers. Literally, and Chantilly snaps. Literally late March, early April, depending on what the spring is like, wet, dry, warm, cool, whatever. And, we could literally have a great cash income in April from those fall planted hardy annuals. And then they're just getting ramped up, right? And so in April, we're already cutting cool flowers. May, we're overcome in cool flowers. And then in June, cool flowers is still going. So guess what? We barely had time to think about starting our warm season tender annuals. So instead of pushing the envelope, we're like, okay, while we're cutting cool flowers, we have to be seed starting on time to get the warm season tender annuals in for their time, which we have figured out when your window is, right? And they're growing up while you're out there cutting flowers out the kazoo. And before you know it, for us, when June comes, that's when cool meets warm. And that's where we are right now. The volume of flowers that we have in late May and all throughout June is ridiculous because we have cool and warm. And for us, our florists are terribly busy during that time. People are still hungry for flowers. It's high season, right? That's embracing 3-season cutting garden. And you know, the Cut Flower Handbook really guides you on the growing details of the varieties and really embracing that whole succession and just learning how to push the limits and and then you figure out, okay, I can plant warm season. I could plant, we have like a 6-month warm season here. I could plant every month. I could plant 6 times. And if you're in high volume and you have enough help, there's benefits to that. But maybe you only do 3 times. Do you know? I mean, it's like knowing your options. And people really resist a really frequent question that I get about this whole embracing succession planting is, but if they're branchers and they keep blooming, why would I plant them again? Friends, the same reason you put a seatbelt on and get homeowners insurance. It's the day you need them that you really understand, oh, that's why. So for us, let's just say that we planted warm season tender annuals 4 times over the summer months. That's not including the sunflowers we plant every week, right? And so you plant the first one, and then depending on your timing, we like 4 to 6 weeks later would be planting the second. So here's what our schedule is. We start our first warm season tender annuals like 4 to 6 weeks before our last spring frost, typically. We get them started. Meantime, we're cutting cool flowers. Then we start planting them right in mid-April, which is when my last frost passed. So we're planting and we're planting and we're planting. And then we're also netting. We're getting that garden ready. And by the time we get them planted and netted, guess what? It's time to start the second warm season tender annuals, which then will be getting planted in 4 to 6 weeks. And that's how you time yourself out. So when you plant multiple times, not only does the quality of your stems change. I mean, I understand people like, oh my gosh, I just don't have that much help. Then you don't need to do maybe 4. Maybe you do at least 2. Because the other thing to think about is changing your colors up for the seasons. Our first one is not fall colors, right? So you definitely want to have multiple warm season plantings, not only because of the whole color thing, not because of the whole quality and volume and quantity, but what if something happens? What if you get pests somewhere in one of your crops? When you know that you have another crop coming along of that same flower over yonder, it helps a lot. Or for us, a torrential downpour that just lays out a bed, and it is so much easier just to mow that bed because guess what? You have another bed coming along, and it just ups your game. And I can remember thinking, why should I do that? But now that I've been doing it for 15 years that way, there's no question, hands down, that's what made us successful. Quality, abundance, and once we got our systems down. So friends, sorry, I've been a little long-winded, but I just think this is so essential. In flower farming school, one of the things that I hit home is that it is so simple to be successful as a flower farmer. Being good at the basics makes you advanced, meaning mastering some of these things that I actually just talked about. And if you're that person that is looking to generate profit, money, doing something you love every day, it starts with every crop you decide to grow. That's the thing that you really need to think about. So friends, I hope that this you found this to be, inspiring and good, timely information. And, the Field and Garden podcast is produced and supported from the Gardener's Workshop, and we're located in southeastern Virginia. And I invite you to join with us as we explore so many opportunities and challenges of growing cut flowers for profit and for pleasure. And our mission is to equip you to grow cut flowers at every level around the world. Doesn't matter where you are. In addition to this podcast, we have resources like videos, blogs, my books, unique online courses that will meet you where you are in your cut flower growing journey. One example is our Flower Farming School online series of courses that teaches how to get started, then how to expand, and then how to extend your flower farming business season. Friends, we are just so grateful for your support. By liking, sharing, and leaving a review of any of our resources helps us so much, because everything we do, guys, we do it to help you, and we appreciate it so much. So friends, till we meet again, ciao.